Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name's Kate Newey. I have to do the description. The main things about me is I wear glasses and I've got a lot of blonde hair, I guess. White, late middle-aged woman. Speaking to you from the attic in Exeter, Devon, with the obligatory bookcases behind me. It's my great privilege and an awful lot of fun, actually, in chairing and acting as respondent to this session, in which we're going to meet the recipient of this year's Early Career Research Prize from TAPRA, Dr. Naomi Paxton. Before Naomi appears, as if by magic, I just want to give you a few housekeeping details. As you heard, the session is being recorded. The session is also being captioned in closed captions. You will find the closed captioning button at the bottom of your screen. So too, you will find the raising hand icon as part of, I know most of you know this, but just to go through it, as part of the reactions button at the bottom of your screen. And I think if we have a lot of questions, I'd like to take them via the official raised hand icon, and then I can see the order in which they appear and call on you. If we've got a reasonable amount of time, we'll call on you to uncloak yourself visually and orally to speak directly to Naomi. But if we've got a lot of questions, it may well be that we'll have to just ask you to quickly put stuff in the chat, and Naomi and I will work through the chat for her to respond to your comments and questions. I hope you've all watched her video. It's a rather wonderful keynote, certainly the most entertaining one I've come across in many years. So what we're going to do is I'll introduce Naomi, then I'll give a brief response to the keynote. She and I have got some things, I've got a lot of questions I want to ask her, but then for about the last half hour, we'll open it up to the whole Zoom room. And Joe Scott wonderfully has put the link to Naomi's keynote in the chat. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Naomi Paxton, who is a recipient of the TAPRA Early Career Research Prize. Her official scholarly roles are as Knowledge Exchange Fellow at the Central School for Speech and Drama, and also as a Parliamentary Academic Fellow, which is a fascinating role that I hope she'll say something more about. So Naomi, would you like to make yourself present? There she is. She's also a member of the Magic Circle. There's hopefully we'll talk a little bit about that aspect of her work. So I just wanted to say how much I enjoyed your keynote, and it made me think of, I'm inevitably going to quote Virginia Woolf here. It made me think of what Virginia Woolf writes when she says that if we're writers, we think back through our mothers. And I think what you do beautifully is get us to think about our feminist mothers and that tradition of female handing on of knowledge. And I know we talked about the fact that you also talked to a colleague and mentor of mine. So there's a wonderful kind of chain here, Julie Hollidge, who in writing her book, Innocent Flowers, about Edwardian women's work in the theatre, had actually interviewed some of the later suffragettes and suffrage workers, and that you actually have those tapes and have digitized them. So I think there's something quite wonderful there about that line of thinking back, and then your role in thinking forward. So that's really my very brief response. I won't hog too much time. But my questions, I suppose, start with that thinking back. And we know in 2018, which was the one of the memorials in terms of women's suffrage, there's always a little bit of a chatter in dealing with the suffragist and suffragette movement in Britain at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. The critique that, oh, well, it was just middle class and aristocratic women only looking after the middle class women. And I wondered if you wanted to say something about the kind of ways that feminists then were packaged, as it were, in history, in popular history and academic or scholarly history.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Kate. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us. I am a short white woman in my, don't tell anyone, early 40s with short white dyed hair, and I'm sitting in my office, which has got loads of books, and I've put some fairy lights up. Hello. Yeah, so yes, it's really interesting. And I worked on a big project in the year Vote 100. I was actually working in Parliament then as well in 2018. And it's interesting, the negativity, the negative stereotypes surrounding the suffrage movement generally. And those are the things that we saw getting shared a lot. So the negative cartoons, the negative imagery. It's really interesting to me that the musical songs that have been digitally remastered are all anti-suffragist songs, that the films that we know about that have been digitally remastered and made available on DVD are all anti-suffragist films. And so we lose quite a lot of the pro arguments, or we lose some of the reasons why they were wanting the vote. And theatre, and the way that the suffrage campaign used theatre from 1908 onwards, is a really great way of talking about the arguments, the whys, and making those things personal. And in terms of the middle class women and upper class women, I would say what they did was use their privilege, they used their resources, they used their privilege, and they used their education. And what was interesting about the Actresses Franchise League, which I've written about in my monograph, is that they saw themselves as representing a contingent of working women, because they were earning their own money and paying their taxes. They had sort of stepped outside some of that traditional role of wifehood and motherhood, although many of them were trying to juggle that at the same time. And they saw themselves as representing working women. And then we also, I don't know, it's very different at drama school now. When I was at drama school back in just 2001, we were taught to speak in an RP accent. One creates a sound for oneself for employment that is posher, or slightly more mannered than maybe how one spoke when one went to drama school. Certainly that's the case for me, or I think nowadays drama schools are encouraging people to embrace their voices. So like the suffrage movement, there are many complexities in this conversation of who the vote is for. What we do know, however, is that, and that's why I really wanted to include that 1918 deputation document in the talk, is that we do know that even at that crux point of 1918, when they were being offered the vote for some women, which was women over 30 or 35 with property or a certain amount of education, they were still campaigning for all women to get the vote on the same terms as men. So I think it's really about looking at the way that the media and that our culture skews stories about feminism and stories about feminist activism that it finds distasteful, or that it finds problematic, or that it finds too challenging, or sometimes too ubiquitous. And then sort of just not necessarily retroactively fitting that onto stories from 100 years ago, but just doing that with the same mindset, looking back and going, how come these stories have pervaded through the culture? How can we hear about this? And what's the kind of victim blaming that goes on when we look at suffrage campaigners? Oh, they wanted this and they wanted that, they weren't all things to all people, rather than looking at the opposition that kept them without the vote and in that campaign saying pretty much the same thing for over 60 years.
Rookie error. Unmuting myself. I'm always struck by the endurance of some of the, well, it's not just anti-feminist, it's anti-woman kinds of arguments that we still have. It's within my living memory of seeing news announcements about equal pay for equal work, for example. But there's a lot that actually comes out of that answer, and I wonder, I'm probably guilty of starting backwards. Do you want to say something for those who haven't watched your, tut to those people who haven't watched your wonderful video, but you know, we're busy. So do you want to say something about this moment of 1908 and the formation of the Actresses Franchise League, and about the role of theatre in feminist activism 100 years ago?
Thank you. So the suffrage campaign had been going on since the 1860s. The Women's Social and Political Union, which is the activist group that a lot of people know about, who had purple, green and white, they're actually one of the smallest groups, but they had the most significant branding and were involved in militancy, were formed in 1903. And there isn't really suffrage theatre per se, written by suffragists or including sort of positive direct relation to suffrage arguments. Before that period, really as a concerted campaign, what happens is American actress and playwright Elizabeth Robbins, who many of you may know if you Victorianists about her kind of bringing of Ibsen to the American and the UK stage, she was commissioned to write a play, a 3-act play, by an actress manager called Gertrude Kingston. And Robbins was, I suppose, there are arguments we have, but I suppose I've described her as a feminist, but her biographers say that she didn't have much sympathy with the suffrage campaign, particularly in this period. And she went out to do research on the road. She spent time with suffrage campaigners in different places all over the UK, and she listened to the arguments and she saw how the crowds responded. And through that process of research, she became a suffrage campaigner. She wrote the play, which eventually became Votes for Women, and went on to the Royal Court stage. And when we look at her kind of her involvement with the suffrage movement around 1905 and 1906, there are sort of dinner party menus that I found where she sat next to the Shaws, and she sat next to the kind of prominent suffrage campaigners. And so I think it became clear that theatre and performance was a really great way of speaking to a range of different people, taking a range of different voices and bringing them to stages. Now, not necessarily theatre stages, as I kind of say in my introduction to that, in all kinds of spaces. And one of the most exciting things for me as a researcher is that actually the women and men involved in the Actresses Franchise League, which then started in November 1908, and the Women Writers Suffrage League, which had started a couple of months earlier, is that they didn't do all female Shakespeares. They didn't do all female versions of classic plays. They commissioned and created new work based on their experiences of activism and based on the issues that were happening. And they were suffragist and feminist issues. And for me, that's a really exciting space to be in theatrically, and a really exciting glimpse into the world and the language of the campaign. And because they were tactically neutral, which was a very canny, a broad church, both organisations, which meant that they had members who were both militant campaigners and smashed things and went to prison for doing so. And they also had members who were violently against, ironically enough, militancy. And they were a broad church, and they worked with every other single suffrage society. And that was a key part of their founding principles. And so that's been a really interesting thing as well. What the plays say, who they're for, how they frame suffrage activism, because of course censorship is very active in this period, and you can't just write blood and thunder plays and expect them to be able to, be on the public stage or to be published. So there's a lot of subtlety, I think, in these discussions. And so I would say November or the autumn of 1908 is where it starts really for suffrage theatre, off the back of Elizabeth Robbins' sort of pioneering work. And then with the formation of the Women Writers Suffrage League and the Actresses Franchise League, the ball starts rolling and quickly gains momentum.
That's wonderful. I mean, we could talk forever about Elizabeth Robbins. What I find really interesting, and it goes to your comment about the broad church of the suffrage movement, but also the broader feminist movement, is that Elizabeth Robbins had an ongoing and very long collaboration and friendship with Lady Florence Bell, who was quite anti the women having the vote. They collaborated on an amazing play. Whenever I teach it, Alan's Wife, which comes before some of the suffrage stuff and really fits into this sort of new drama model, but is clearly identifying issues, particularly for working class women at the time. And it's testament to female friendship, I think, and female collaboration at that time. That Bell and Robbins maintained a very close, they wrote plays together. Apart from being in a domestic romantic relationship, there's not much you could do that would be closer than that, I think. Do you want to say something more perhaps about the kinds of plays and spaces? I mean, when I've written about this, I think that some of those plays are like really early agitprop. That there's so can you give us some examples, some flavour of that, and perhaps talk about the Suffrage Plays reading group that you have conducted throughout lockdown, because I think that's marvellous to hear about.
Sure. Just to briefly come back to a point of about the kind of the mother, sort of adopted motherness of that. In Cicely Hamilton, who is another suffrage playwright and a performer in this period, that she gave a speech to a group of activists in 1911, and there were lots of tensions within the movement, people having different views about the same thing, and she said, and I'm going to quote this because I think it's wonderful, I think all of us ought to realise that one of the big causes that lies behind the suffrage movement is the new consciousness in women that she is free to think for herself. Think of the years, of the generations that women have been told they must not think. It is only within the last generation that we have found we have a brain and a mind and begun to stumble slowly forward and to bring a new view to bear upon things as they are, and not only upon things as they ought to be. We see things with a view which is entirely different from that which our brothers had. They saw them as their fathers saw them, but we see things very differently from the way our mothers saw them. I just think that's a really beautiful piece.
Wonderful. Thank you for that.
Pleasure. She's wonderful. Yes, plays. Yes. So there are loads of suffrage plays, and yes. There are, well, the wonderful Dr. Susan Croft sort of estimates in her anthology there are about 120 suffrage plays performed between the years 1907 and 1914, which is a tremendous number of plays around a particular cause and around a theme. There are monologues, there are duologues, there are short sketches, there are 3-act plays, there are songs, there are poems, there were dances, there were operettas, there was a film, all sorts of stuff, all sorts of material. And I've written about Suffrage Punch and Judy, for example. I've written about adaptations of Alice in Wonderland. I've written about prison cell immersive installations. There are activists on the New York subway doing a sort of site-specific embodied protest. It's wonderful. There are all sorts of ways that suffrage theatricals are reaching out to the potential audience that might be there. And yes, some of them are on stages, but most often or not, they're in restaurants, particularly vegetarian restaurants. Outdoor spaces are free and you don't need to hire them if you're having a fundraising meeting, so large outdoor spaces at meetings. Suffrage plays were very rarely just seen as standalone pieces. They were done really in the context of meetings, or they were bookended as part of other events. So they were always contextualized by what was going on, and then framed within the theme of whatever conversation that meeting was part of, or whatever suffrage society they were being performed for or by. So there is a huge variety of work, and it genuinely spans genres, and it's written by people who are very established and successful commercial playwrights and people who are writing just for the first time. So it varies widely. And there are plays with sort of hardcore plays about sex trafficking that didn't pass the censor. We read 2 of those actually in the suffrage play reading group. There's a play where everybody is a parrot, which is surprisingly moving. There are kind of verse plays and symbolic plays, and then there are tiny sort of domestic dramas. What's interesting about a lot of them is they're quite easy to stage. You really just need sort of 2 chairs and a table to stage most of them, which makes them very portable and easy to put on wherever you are. So that's fantastic. The Suffrage Plays reading group, I just set up over Zoom during the first lockdown, actually. It started because I was writing a chapter about Alice in Wonderland and suffrage plays, and I was reading through this play and I just needed to hear it. I couldn't, these plays are meant to be spoken, aren't they? So I got some chums together who everyone was very sad because all the work had dried up, and we read this play and they were really stimulated about it over Zoom. So we kept that going, and it really gave me a chance to try, as I said in the talk, to try some of the plays that are not my sort of the top ones I do to impress people, or kind of, you know, top 10 suffrage plays, but ones that are a bit more chewy, or ones where I wanted to open up ideas of discussion. And things were coming up again and again about agency and representation, about who has power, about ideas, subjectivity, about ideas of is this good? Is always an interesting conversation to get into. Why don't we know about this? Who the writers are? What's the context of the writing? So it just kind of allowed me and a group of people, some of whom who knew about suffrage plays and some of whom didn't, to just tease out some of these threads in a space that was available to us, and a really lovely way to make contact with not only new performers but also with academics across the space and across their time zones, which was just such a pleasure.
Yes, I've been able to join a couple of them, and I've very much experienced that. My undergraduates, when I teach my Women in Performance course, which goes from Susanna St. Lever right through to 1928, and they say, how have we done 3 years at university and this is the first time we've heard about these women, and the sense that they've lost, you know, that we and I say to them, well, looking at women's history is a choice, and it's a choice that is not often enough made. So to move that to thinking about how we might change the canon in this way, both for the industry, You know, Sam Walters was trying to do some of that work at the Orange Tree a few years ago, but also in the academy. What kinds of things would you start to say there, particularly to those of us all listening who might want to pick up some of this work? In what ways do you feel in your work you're trying to do that or have done it?
There are two excellent books out, the Matthew and Drama Book of Suffrage Plays and the Matthew and Drama Book of Suffrage Plays Taking the Stage. You should definitely get those. I mean, it's sort of fallen between theatre history and women's history, so I'm trying to sort of bring some of those things together. But yes, I think you should read Suffrage Plays. I think you should look at Suffrage Plays. I think you should be aware that this enormous kind of political theatre movement was happening in the 1910s. But for me, it's not about recreating those plays or about putting those plays on necessarily. It's about harnessing the energy of that movement and realising that the legacy, the kind of systemic inequalities in theatre, particularly around women's roles and access to women's, for particularly sustained opportunities, even for those with vast economic resources, the systemic inequality goes on. And it's not about certain people kind of shutting things down, it's about the system, and it's about the way that the system is run and perpetuated. And so I think it's really important for these plays to be part of the canon, for the Actresses Franchise League story to be part of the canon, because it just opens up a whole different way of thinking about that space. And we also realise that there are, as I say in the talk, there are really strong shoulders to stand on for activists moving forward. There are beautiful, thoughtful, powerful, informed words written by theatre professionals, both female and male, from 100 years ago that help us articulate our sense of frustration or our sense of optimism or our anger or our hope or our passion for some of these topics. Now, they don't tick all the boxes, but they're a really good starting point. And I think for me, it's about connecting with myself as a human and connecting with my friends and my colleagues, both in and out of the industry and in and out of academia, and just thinking that change is a long game, that the same things need to be said over and over again. The suffrage movement teaches us that some opposition is active and some is passive, that some is lazy, that tradition slides over a lot, that some things could be changed very quickly that would make people a lot more able to do what they want to do, that talent doesn't discriminate, and that actually there's so much that we can take from this period. So I would say, yes, read Suffrage Plays, look up this period, there's so much brilliant work. And if you want to do Edwardian plays with great parts for women, often very funny, most of them are comedies, funny parts of women, definitely do these plays. But really what's important is the fact that these people were there. This is what they were doing. These are the networks. This is what they were fighting for. These are the national and international links they were part of. And this is the legacy of particularly feminist activism within our industry. It goes back way beyond kind of second wave feminism in the theatre. And for me, that's the thread that's the thing that continues to hook me in. I love the specificity of it, but it speaks to me as a human who participates in the world in this period to just go, gosh, this has been going on a long time.
Yeah, I found that in working on 19th century women playwrights, that they themselves, since Susanna St. Lever, in fact, wanted to be seen as playwrights, not women that there's this driving urge all the time for that kind of energy to be part of the industry. You mentioned that you set up this Suffrage Plays reading group during the first lockdown. Do you want to say something? And I think this might lead us into perhaps opening up to the whole room, the Zoomer room, in terms of questions. Do you want to say something about what happens? And you say in your talk, when you can't go forward, go sideways. So what did you do as a very marginally and indeed precariously employed academic? I should emphasize that, because I know you don't want to be seen as someone who's very kind of smug and secure in a position. No, I don't think anyone would think you were smug, my dear. What kinds of things did you think about, with COVID and lockdowns kind of scuppering plans over the last 2 years? What have been your strategies? And what can the women of 1908 teach us?
I'd love to have had strategies. I think part of the reason I chose the AFL to talk about for this talk was that, again, that sense of just having to change things, just having to change instantly. In fact, when I was doing my PhD, I thought I was going to be researching the Edwardian theatre and suffrage movement. I never thought I'd be researching, you know, toys and military hospitals and martial arts. I never thought I'd be entering into those worlds. And I think the Actors Franchise League were very much involved in the suffrage campaign, and then it got to the August of 1914, and then everything just fell apart, and they scrambled and they worked as hard as they could with all the resources they already had to try and be useful, to try and move sideways. And I think for me, I mean, I had obviously had a lot of my freelance work cancelled. I had all my performance work cancelled. And I was working on a funding application that then couldn't happen because that was about going internationally in research in the women's theatre. Then my backup funding application idea couldn't happen because that was about archives, which were not only closed due to COVID, but also potentially closing, many of them. And then I felt very strongly during particularly the Black Lives Matter movement that I should just be useful and think about legacy. It wasn't about what I wanted to research, it was about what was important, what stories needed to come out of the archives, and I could get into the archives. So I spent a lot of time, and I had lots of writing to do and very little motivation because I didn't have anybody to talk to, and I didn't have anybody to have those sort of exchanges with. And I felt it was sort of too significant to book a Zoom with people just to sort of get an idea over. I thought, well, they'll say I'm stupid, I didn't know what to do. So I think it was just a process of actually going through my PhD research, looking back at all those photos I took and all those, since I did it, so many more things have been digitized. There's so much easier access to stuff, including free access. And really looking at that work from a more informed perspective. And I think I've been so busy kind of running forward and looking for the next thing and looking for the next hook and trying to hustle across different genres or different bits of life that I hadn't really gone back and appreciated how far I'd come in my thinking from when I first found this information. So actually immersing myself in that research was really lovely. Reading was just lovely. And then as we began to do like Zoom performances or performances over various types of streaming services, and then to get back to kind of live performances last summer, a little bit with the audience, just the importance again of that that audience performer relationship, and the way that audiences were very different and wanted to hear different things from performers. So I think it was just across a range of things. I did get some freelance work eventually, bought a ring light and a green screen and recorded some stuff for people and made that happen. I did get quite a lot of my writing done. I've still got some chapters overdue, but I've been able to get back to the library. And then my performance work has picked up again. So it's been tricky, but I think I'd love to have had some grand strategy. I think it was just feeling my way and trying to look at this amazing room and how lucky I am to be surrounded by all my books in this place, and how fortunate I am to have these documents on my computer, and sort of try and zone in for the parts when I wasn't looking at the news or worrying desperately about everything, to zone in and immerse myself again in this research and refine stories that I'd forgotten about in that research and repackage them.
You make it sound easy. I'm sure it wasn't. Can you tell me about the one other thing that you did during lockdown in terms of your performing career and the magic that we referred to at the very beginning of the session?
During the Magic Circle?
Yeah.
Well, that had been on the cards for a while, but I just thought it was, again, as I say in the talk, you know, the Magic Circle only let women be members in 1995, and it was also founded in, I think, 1908. And I'd first got in touch with them because one of the founding members of the Magic Circle had performed at a suffrage fair in 1911, a fair that was run by them, where all the entertainments were run by the men's political union, by male suffragists. And I was really intrigued, and I could never get any further. So I've kind of been toying with the Magic Circle and having conversations with them. And I thought, oh, do you know what? Sod it, I'll just apply. And so I had to, because I couldn't go into the headquarters, I couldn't have a live audition. I had to be interviewed over Zoom, and I had to talk about the book. Some of these books are magic books. I'm not telling you which. And then I had to do a magic trick live with the interviewer, and then I had to send off a pre-recorded video. Luckily, I've got lots of footage. To the examiners, who 3 of them passed it and then told me I was in. So now I'm in. And then in January, I ended up doing a talk for a big Magic Circle Unlocked event about when Christabel Pankhurst was asked if she'd be sawn in half as a publicity stunt on stage in 1921. So I was able immediately to get some suffrage chat into the Magic Circle, whether it was welcome or not.
That's wonderful. That's absolutely wonderful. And I think my final kind of question, and just to say to people, start thinking up your questions and putting your hands up for Naomi or putting things in the chat. My final question really is the vegetarian restaurants and jiu-jitsu. And we were talking when we were sort of talking before this to prepare for this session. You were saying that what you found were these what you weren't expecting, the sort of unlikely hooks into the work. So I think we all want to know about jiu-jitsu and vegetarian restaurants, please.
Well, hot foot it to my YouTube channel, whereas there's a video of my first discussions about Edith Garrod, Jiu-Jitsu suffragette. I also did a couple of pieces for Radio 4's Making History about that, so that will be on iPlayer. A really interesting part of the suffrage movement, a really interesting way of presenting violence, particularly bloodless violence. And then I actually ended up researching a lot about the women police during World War I who were also learning jiu-jitsu, actually, as were the police in this period. So it's a really interesting thing, and there is lots out there, so do go and look for that. The vegetarian restaurants thing, yes, fascinating, and again, as I say in the talk, part of a much wider kind of movement, as was jiu-jitsu, around health and strength, and around trying to think and eat and live more ethically, particularly around anti-vivisection and animal rights in this period. So again, it touches many things, and I think one of the things that I did the New Gen Thinkers scheme in 2014-15, and one of the things that really, it was a bit like being a seal, because I was still in the final year of my PhD. I was kind of a seal coming up for air, and just to sort of resurface and find those hooks, find what turned people on about it, find what intrigued them about it, find what made them laugh about it, find the unexpected stories. And I was very aware, I'd been to, I think, listen to hear Aoife Monks talk about quirk historicism, and for a while I felt quite shy about it. And I thought, you know what, if it gets people interested and it makes that first point of communication, then let's do that. And in 2018, I was really lucky on Radio 3. I did, on the week of the 6th of February, which was the anniversary, every morning I was on Radio 3 telling a different suffrage story from my research, whether that was a suffrage campaigner being smuggled into the London Pavilion in Mari Lloyd's trunks, or the roller rink story, or two women posting themselves as human letters to the Prime Minister as a publicity stunt, or the prison cell installations I've been talking about, just to be able to kind of pull out, I think what I've realised in my research, that people have either a patronising or a very dismissive, often, attitude to suffrage campaigners. Gosh, they're boring, they're dour, they've got big hats, they meant well, but they didn't do anything. And if you begin to just tell some human stories that are unexpected but absolutely true, and stories that they don't expect around, I don't know, queering and dissembling and activism, then you can begin to talk to a much wider audience. And it might just be a few people here and there, but you're sharing that information. And if I have, I think we spoke to Kate about this when we were chatting, but I think if I'm going to be useful doing what I do, the best thing I can do is try and create as much content that's findable as possible for future generations of scholars who, when they find this work, hopefully will look back and go, how can I find out more about that? Who knows what the resources will be? Who knows what archives would have been uncovered? But when they look back and they try and find stuff, I'm trying to leave just things for them to be able to find and directions to go into, because my own PhD research went not only across many different disciplines and genres, but across many different archives, including medical archives that were completely unexpected. So yeah, that. Yeah,
great, thank you. I saw Kate Holmes had her hand up, but it's gone now. But Kate, did you want to unmute and ask a question or make a comment?
I mean, to be honest, Naomi's kind of slightly answered it, which was, I think what I was thinking is like the impression that we have of the suffrage movement is very serious. But actually what has come out of your discussion and sort of the things that you brought to light is actually how much fun, you know, the fact that the Magic Circle are going to, somebody from the Magic Circle is going to saw a campaigner in half, and that you've got roller skating, that actually it's a much more dynamic and active movement than maybe we've given it credit for. So, but you sort of, it was really that role of playfulness and fun that maybe has been forgotten.
I think most also we need to think about why we think it wouldn't be playful and fun, and why we think they wouldn't use. I mean, the guy sawing Christopher Pankausenhoff is dark, super dark actually, which is why she turned it down. But there's a check out my YouTube for that video. But there's I think why we assume, we just need to look at why we assume they were boring and by default therefore ineffectual, or not interesting, or not worthwhile, or not dynamic. It's that the legacy of that storytelling is really interesting, and one of the big challenges has been how to find ways to begin to open up that story. I was thinking, so in 2018 I had to get some sweets made to entice people to a stall I had about votes for women in World War One, and we were just going to get a box of celebrations, and then actually there was a bit of money, and I had some votes for women rock sweets made. Ooh. With hair drop flavour, with votes for women written in the middle. Of course, everyone wants sweets, and it was 2018, so everyone wanted kind of, little memento things, but I thought things they could Instagram. But on the colours on the outside of the sweet, so everyone was going on about purple, green and white that year, and all the suffrage historians were going, oh, the colours are available. I put, because there were many different suffrage societies, all with different colours, I put red, gold, purple, green and white to represent the three largest suffrage societies. And that opened up so many conversations with people who were going, how come I thought it was all purple, green and white? Oh, how interesting. Thank you for asking me that question. Let's start that. Now, you didn't have to ask it. You didn't need to notice it. Suffrage historians were thrilled. And it did help me shut down some brilliant conversations on Twitter. I had a couple. Now, tone is hard, but I had a couple of things on Twitter where I imagine people went, I think you'll find suffragette colours were purple, white and green. And I was like, oh, thank you so much. Here we go. And just immediately get out information. So I think there are ways to open up a conversation that invite people in rather than sort of blast. But yeah, that why were the suffragettes so boring and rubbish is a conversation we really need to have with ourselves.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Naomi. Dale Spender could possibly know, Dale Spender only wears purple, green and white clothing. So you need to contact her and say she can wear red and gold as well.
No, by all means do, but just make sure it's not the only, you think it's the only colour available.
But I think your point about the ways in which we can bring people into our research and not be, well, I know one of my principles is I take my work seriously, but I don't take myself particularly seriously. And I know that you talk a lot about bringing the human to the scholarship, being yourself in the work. I'm looking to see, we haven't got any hands up. Anna Helena McLean has asked if we could have the Cicely Hamilton quotation to share. I mean, it might, the chat may well disappear with this, it might not because it's being recorded, but where is that from? Is that in an easily accessible essay of Hamilton's? Is it in her novels, or can you? We're asking for the footnote now, you see.
No, it's fine. Let me just check. So it's in The Vote, which is the newspaper of the Women's Freedom League. And that is available, if you have access to the British Newspaper Archive, that's available on there. But it's also available for free on Google Newspapers. You just look up Google Newspapers. The Vote, now this top tip, is listed under Google Newspapers as the Globe. For reasons. But if you go on there on the 14th of January 1911 edition, you'll find that whole speech. But I can also, I'll find a way to post that, or if you're interested, email me. My contact details are on my profile in Shed, and I will I can send that to you directly as a link.
Great, thanks. Or you could pop it up on the Scud list or something like that. That would be really great. And I mean, just a side note that when one does any kind of research into women and women's work and women's lives, you're always finding the masked identities, aren't you? Whether it's their married name or their family name. But your example of The Vote being catalogued as the Globe is just it's another of those examples of these cloaked. I think some of the work that we do on women's history is making visible the previously invisible, who were there all the time. That's the great irony, isn't it? So we have a question in the chat from Irini. I wanted to ask about the really brilliant octopus tentacles. Could you say more about it, Naomi? Is it a way of thinking, a methodology at work, or something else?
So
Great
yes,
question.
thank you for that, really. So yes, so the second thing, the Women's Emergency Corps was described by somebody who went to its Bedford Street offices as an immense but coordinated octopus, which I always thought was a fantastic expression and description of just how extraordinary and the range of work they were doing was. So when I was thinking about that, I was thinking about I often describe myself as having fingers in pies, and also fingers in things that just say pie, and I don't know if they are pies, you know, just because that's the thing when you're freelance, or even when, you know, when you're precariously employed ECR, is that you're constantly, you've got one head on what you're doing and one head on the future and stuff that doesn't work out, or funny applications that don't happen, or pictures that don't, whatever it is. And so I was thinking about that, the need to have those things all going on at the same time. And so some of those tentacles are from quotes from the Women's Emergency Corps. So be elastic, for example, is one of those. The moving sideways, if you can't move forwards, move sideways is mine, really, thinking about this whole past 18 months. So it's really a mashup of things that either the Women's Emergency Corps and the other Actors Franchise League projects were doing, and lessons that I felt I needed to take from those things and just slightly repackaged to make it fit into a tentacle. But it was just a way of thinking that I've always admired. And then when I was thinking about this talk, I just thought, yeah, there's so much going on, and often we kind of need asked to box ourselves in one particular thing. What do you do? Or, you know, what are you working on? And often we're working on all sorts of things, and that sort of being a human and a scholar is particularly now, particularly for ECRs, is you're having to make connections between your real life. You're having to use elements of your real life or your existing networks to think about how you might engage different people with your work, or how you might engage different people with a project, or where you might move forward next. And so I kind of thinking myself as that central octopus with all the things going on is actually feels less chaotic and more empowering.
Oh, that's great. Yes, I think you've described many a scholar's life, academic life, is that we are multitaskers often, and then you add your situation of precarity and freelance work into that. There's a resilience there too in the octopus. You know, an arm gets cut off and they grow another one, as far as I understand, but that's a bit gruesome. While people are thinking about what they might, question from Jane Gold. Can you tell us a little more about your public engagement walks?
Yes,
That's
with pleasure.
From Jane Gold. Yes.
Thank you, Jane Gold. Excellent question. So I started working with a feminist theatrical hub called Scary Little Girls, actually way back in 2008, to do an event about the Actors Franchise League at the Orange Tree, curiously enough. Just as I was finding out about the Actors Franchise League. But they do something called Living Literature Walks, and I've done 3 of those with them. So we've done one called Stage Rights, and that was based around the West End, sort of telling the story of the Actresses Franchise League, and it's site specific. And so it takes in locations, it takes in original plays. We also commission new material. I was saying about that roller skating one, where we don't have material, or where we want to tell a different story, we commission new material. And the audience self-guide, so they go as a group of about 15. They leave from a specific point. So when we've done it in the West End, we've left from the theatre or Drury Lane. They self-guide, and I write a whole, as I do with my walking tours, I write that all down, and then there are certain points in the written guide they're all following where there'll just be a sort of symbol, and then they know that a performer is somewhere, and that could be somebody sitting outside a cafe, like a duologue outside a cafe, somebody clinging to a lamppost wearing roller skates, people in a park, wherever it is, there'll be something. And the audience members, we often give them things to take along with them. So we've done 2 other versions. We've done the Shakespeare Hut Walk, which was about the Shakespeare Hut in Bloomsbury in World War I. And so for there, the starting point was Senate House, and the end point was a marquee we'd set up just opposite the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, where we invited people in. The audience were given a key at the beginning of the walk. They didn't know what it was for, but it was actually for the gate to the garden at the end of the walk to come in. We gave them some gunfire tea, black tea and rum, which is what the Anzac soldiers were drinking during World War I. And then I was there actually with the expert on the Shakespeare Hut, Dr. Elsa Grant Ferguson, to answer any questions about that work. And then the most recent one we did was about women and the West End and the Western Front. It's about women in World War I. And for that, we started at the Feminist Library in Lambeth, and then walked across Waterloo Bridge, the Ladies' Bridge, and then a little bit through into the West End. And so for each one of them, really, I've wanted to pull Suffrage Theatre out of that kind of big hats moment, and go, well done, what lovely big hats you've got, and actually move it into the human stories of it all. And by commissioning new work from performers, or writing new work, we're able to work with performers in a different way, in an unexpected way. We're able to cast in a much more interesting and inclusive way, because people don't have a preset idea of what they're going to see. We're able to tell different stories about different bits of London, different theatrical histories of London, feminist histories of London. And what I love about it is that the audience takes the guide away with them at the end, so they can redo that walk as much as they like. And that I know that the research is completely solid, but I want to make sticky moments for them as they go around these places, or curious encounters with theatre, with performers, with some original text, with some new text, with some readings, with some moments. And that I'm not in control of that experience. I don't know what they're experiencing. I don't know what their history with London is, or those pieces, or those people, or whatever those spaces are. So it's the making of the meaning is in the hands of the audience members in the particular group they're in how much they relate to the content, if they keep the guide or they don't, or if they interact or they don't. The performers find it fascinating because it's a really interesting space to be in, dealing often in the open air with people across different spaces and times. I find it fascinating to write, and we've had some really interesting collaborations, and been able to kind of, again, there are sort of Easter eggs in there. So for the one we did in 2016, we had in St Paul's Church in Covent Garden, where there are a lot of plaques to Actors Franchise League members in there. We had a play about a suffrage play about a woman who decides to wear men's clothing in order that she can move more freely about the streets, not get sexually harassed, and get paid more for the work that she's already doing. And in that play, we had a feminist comedian, and we had a member of Monstrous Regiment performing that. Now, if you don't know that doesn't matter. It's just a really interesting piece. But if you do know, it is about those legacies of feminist activism. It's about the interesting piece, an unexpected piece from 1911, and a feminist activist from the second wave, and a current radical feminist activist and performer from now. And it's really, I'm trying to create as many layers, so that as much as you know, you can enjoy it at every level. And if you don't know anything, you're fine, you're not excluded from anything. So it's been a really interesting way to explore that work, and to find, again, you might not do a whole play, a whole suffrage play, but you might find a little scene that you think this would be a lovely duologue, and then we could set this somewhere and make the audience. There's a lovely one actually from the First World War, A Bit of Blighty by Evelyn Glover.
I love her work.
Yeah,
where two women is hilarious.
It's wonderful. So two women are having their pictures taken for a soldier at the front, and it's a fun piece. And so for that one, we sent the audience off in their bag of goodies. They had a disposable camera, and they didn't know why, and they just happened to enter scene at exactly the right point that these women were needing their photo taken for the moment. So it's just trying to create a surprising, informative, creative experience for the performers and for audience members, and something that they can keep and think about if they want to.
And that's where theatre becomes, your emphasis on theatre. I just, before we go to Heike's question, if you don't mind, well, Heike, can you say a little bit about what you know about the audiences for those walks? Do you know anything about, what kind, are they people who would sign up for the red coat, the guided blue badge guide walks, and are they blue badge guide, or do you get to talk to the audiences? What kinds of people sign up for these walks, or have in the past, obviously?
Yeah, it just depends where you advertise them and what the audience is. We get a huge range, and that's partly to do with the casting. So for our Women of War walk, for example, I cast a wonderful chum of mine called Donna, who does an amazing drag act. She's a drag king, and they're called Don Juan. And so she and I were able to go on Diva Radio and talk to that audience and tell a story of, and that was based on, this is curious, there's a young adult novel that was published in 2018, fantastic, about a young queer munitions worker. And I was reading the novel, because I'm a dutiful suffrage person, and thinking some of this sounds a bit familiar. And then when I met the author, it turns out she'd got my first book of suffrage plays and had lifted some of the lines from some of the plays in. So that had directly informed the novel. Yeah. And then she and I collaborated to write a monologue for this young queer munitions worker. And then we asked Donna to play this worker. And so that was just, again, about pulling different audiences in. So we were then able to go, do you know what, you might have seen Don Juan the Drag King, but have you ever thought about coming on a walk about women in World War One? And this is why you could, and this is why it would be interesting. And similar things with different performers, and similar things with different audiences. So Anzac was really interesting. So reaching out to kind of Australian and Kiwi communities in the UK, expat communities, as well as other people, historians, museums, wider arts and humanities. I've done a couple of them as part of the Being Human Festival. So they've been listed as part of those wider arts and humanities programming. But I think it's really trying to be creative about what the walks have in them, and also be creative about the spaces that you're using. So when I've ended walks, say, for example, in Joanna's, which is a theatrical restaurant in London, or in a private members club in London, those are spaces that people often aren't able to access. And so you're just trying to find the hooks in that work for different audiences, to say, you may not look at this and go, I would love to know more about the work of suffragist women in World War One and how they interacted with Anzac soldiers. Woot, what a brilliant afternoon. But then it's my job to go, well, do you know what, actually this is really good. And if you're at all interested in kind of theosophy or kind of esoteric stuff, or queerness, or early photography, or then this might be the thing for you. So then it's about me being a good marketer. But we get really good feedback from the audiences that all the walks have always sold out. So it's really, the demand is there. It's just about trying to make them constantly more accessible. And now actually we're talking about trying to do one that's can be kind of simultaneously live streamed or interacted with by people who are online. So hopefully we'll keep working on that.
Oh, fantastic. I think you've probably got how many people are in this Zoom room, are lining up to do them as soon as you start. Right. So Heike, thank you for your patience. I'll come to your question. Thank you for your great, engaging, generous keynote, Naomi, and I think we would all agree on that. My question too is about public engagement, its relation to research. It's very clear from your work that your public projects are not just ways to communicate findings, but are themselves further opportunities for making findings, searching, asking new or different questions. How useful is the term public engagement, particularly for theatre and performance research, where research is so often already public facing? Do you have any further thoughts on the concept of public engagement? Fantastic question. Thank you, Heike.
Yeah, really good question. Thank you, Heike. Lock the Zoom doors, we're in. Naomi's 9-hour public engagement. Yes, all the thoughts. The term public engagement, I think it's just become the term that we use. One of the projects, so I've been working on a project called the International Parliament's Engagement Network at Parliament, and looking at how public engagement, how parliaments around the world deal with public engagement and what that means for them. And what I found, so when I gave kind of public engagement workshops in the before times, I would quote the NCCP's definition of public engagement, and this is what we all work towards, and that's kind of what I knew about in the arts and humanities. And then when I started working with the people in different parliaments, they don't have any definitions near that, and they're talking about completely different things. So I think if we think about, essentially it's about communication and mutual benefit, and use that as a starting point, then I think it's about what you want to say about your research. I do think theatre research is often public facing. I don't know that it's always public engaging. I don't think necessarily doing a play is public engagement. It depends what you're doing with that audience, why that audience is there, how you're interacting with them. You don't then have to do a play and a talk. That's not necessarily public engagement. I think it's about looking at the initial impulses for communication, what you want to know, and how the audience can help you, or how somebody else outside, particularly of your field, or your discipline or your industry, can help you unpack an issue or help you think differently about an issue and how you might introduce that issue to them. So I think at its basis level, it is just about communication and mutual benefit. And then we can get kind of tangled up in the definitions of it going forward. And of course, different funding bodies and different institutions will have different definitions of it. And all those are sort of often workarounds of pretty much the same thing. So yeah, I do find it as a way of, I do find public engagement, but I think it's because when I started my PhD, I was working in London and doing it by Skype. And so I was only talking to people who weren't in the university or weren't doing PhDs about my research. Those were the only people I really had to talk to apart from my supervisor. And so it was just it was just coming out of it. At one point I had everyone at Billy Elliot box office looking for the location of the Aldwych Inquiries in 1911 during a particularly quiet hour. You know, like I had to talk about it, and so I only talked about it to people who didn't know about it, which meant I was constantly having to explain it and find connections. It's interesting, I think theatre and performance is for me, in my experience of arts and humanities public engagement, theatre and performance often is way behind. I think there are some key people who are doing amazing things, and I think there are some phenomenal projects, and I don't think there's any project I've come across in theatre and performance that doesn't have fantastic public engagement potential, that is sometimes maybe unharnessed or unrecorded. I did a project funded by the British Academy in 2019 in the top of 2020 about public engagement for drama and theatre, early PhD students and early career academics, and the findings for that for me were quite challenging, in that how little people thought their work was of interest, or how worried they were about how their work, if they made their work part of a public engagement project, it would be reductive. There were all sorts of barriers in the way that people had kind of invented for themselves based on this term public engagement. And when we got down to those conversations and we found that spark, what got you into this? You know, how did you get into this? What's interesting about that? What's your point of connection? What's chewy about this? Don't just tell me everything, engage me with something. Then it all blossoms. So I think it's about how we approach it rather than the term. I agree the term isn't dynamic, but I think that's the term we have.
Yeah, that's, and I mean, it is, as you say, really enmeshed with institutional funding, dare I mention the Researchers' Excellence Framework, you know, all, and I wonder if that's partly why that term public engagement has become part of it, because it's hard to demonstrate impact. As you know, we're not quite curing cancer, we're just helping people who may be recovering from, you know, anyway, I'll leave that.
No, that's really hard and really valid. And I think part of the conversation within our discipline is how we advocate for the widening of those boxes.
Yes.
So we need to do the work ourselves to think about how we articulate what we do. I think we wear our learning very lightly, we wear our networks very lightly, and we need to articulate those better. We also need to look at the boxes that need ticking and go, well, actually what we do doesn't exactly fit in this, but make a really good case as to why, rather than just say, I'm not going to engage with it at all, or it's overwhelming, because it needs engaging with, and we can do it brilliantly. It's just about having the confidence to, you might have to spin it, you might have to game it. But actually that gives you some sense of agency over what you're doing. And you can absolutely, it's just as brilliant and communicable as anything else in the world. It just needs articulating in that way.
And I think that thing about gaming and not being afraid of doing that, because sometimes I think, particularly at ECR, PGR level, people get a bit worried about making themselves appear, as it were, trivial. I mean, that's why I've always thought, take the work seriously, don't take yourself seriously. And somewhere in that you can find a way. You know, when I say I work on melodrama and people being tied to railway tracks, and I go, yes, but did you know that, you know, the original one was a man, not a woman, tied to the railway track, and so on. But Sarah Barnes, I think you've got the last question. I was going to read that out, but would you like to unmute and ask Naomi directly? And that's where it's a fantastic question to finish on, actually, I think. So go for it, please.
Okay, yeah, just a kind of practical question as well. At the end of your talk, you advised early career researchers to try and trademark and future-proof our work as much as possible. And while you've demonstrated lots of ways in a way you're doing that, but I wondered if you could expand on what you meant by those words and any kind of pitfalls in that regard. Thanks.
No worries, thank you for your question. I think the pitfalls must be no money. That's a rubbish pitfall. So these cards I did, the Suffragettes game cards, I did with a very good game, Suffragettes, did with an independent card maker, and it had to be that the money we got to make these all had to go to her, and I wrote the copy for these and I publicised these, and my name is on the back of them, but I don't get anything from them at all. But for me at that time, it was more important that they happened and they were out there than that I got 50p per pack or whatever it was, which was a way about establishing. I think about establishing because then I think, well, next time I go and try and do a game about it. And in fact, since then I've had 2 more commissions to make games, and I am now getting paid for those things. So I think it was about having a proof of concept, a proof that it works, proof that it's marketable, and then knowing as well from my own confidence that it was something I could move forward and sell. The pitfalls, yeah, are definitely either hiking someone's work and annoying someone, particularly a senior academic. You really don't want to do that. Just take the bits that you've done. I think it's really about the mindset, about looking at projects that you're involved in. I have been on a number of different projects where I'm the research assistant or the research associate, and so the final project or the monograph that's going to happen or the conference that happened, I'm there, but it's not my work and I wouldn't claim it. But it's finding the little bits within that you can claim, that you need to write for your CV, that you need to write on a funding application. You can say, well, yeah, I didn't come up with the entire concept of that, but actually this is what I did and this is how I can evidence that. And I think particularly moving from job application to job application or from funding application to funding application, increasingly you need to show how you are sort of uniquely placed to do whatever it is you're applying to do, or why they should pick you. And if there are gaps in your CV, or even in your academic CV, even if you're a new PhD student or early career research, you don't have many publications, or you don't have much teaching, or you don't have much public engagement, then really double down with confidence on the things that you have done and take ownership of those things so you can speak about them with confidence. So for me, the pitfalls have been, I suppose, I guess financial, but I'm quite a happy-go-lucky soul, so I don't think I normally think about the negatives too much, otherwise I probably wouldn't do it. But yeah, just take something for yourself, so that you don't constantly having to write to people going, please can you write a letter saying what I did in your project. You've owned it, you've blogged about it, you tweeted about it, you did a video, whatever you do, and you don't have to talk directly to the public about it. But whatever you do, you wrote an article, you pitched this, you did something, you have that for yourself that you can take with you on your journey, and it sort of peels away from that main thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Super. Thank you.
Just to add, from a senior academic, I still feel like I've got most of my career, to go. But anyway, is that in the UK, anyway, we have a thing called the Researcher Concordat, which is a long document. Your university should have signed up to it. But in some, what it really asks people like me, grant holders, to do is to ensure that people we employ as postdocs, research assistants, don't spend all their time doing work for us or our project, but they've got nothing, as Naomi says, they've got nothing to take with them as their own for the next project. So if you find that you're in that situation, it is worth having a look at the Researcher Concordat and just negotiating. Any principal or co-investigator will have had to tell the UKRI that they are familiar with its terms. And you should be able to negotiate what your through line in someone else's project is. I think it's really important for all of us to understand that. Sorry, I'm now getting a bit administrative. We're 3 minutes over 2:30, but we started a wee bit late, so I'm just going to feed through Hannah Greenstreet and Adelina Ong sent through a document that some things that had come up from talking to postgraduates and early career researchers in TAPRA about that kind of what sometimes feels like the wilderness period. And I think all of us, even though it might look like we've had golden careers, I think pretty much every academic in this room, in this Zoom room, will have gone through these kind of wilderness years. And issues around collaboration and competition kind of emerge in those questions. Can you say something a little bit, Naomi, just I suppose final advice about, I suppose, how one deals with that in terms of the work, but also in terms of staying happy, being true to yourself? What would be, I'm asking you for pearls of wisdom now.
No, gosh, no pressure.
No pressure at all.
In terms of the competition point, I think Adelina spoke very well on that actually last night in the post-PhD funding session, which I'm sure is available on YouTube. I think for me, it was different because I wasn't part of a PhD cohort. I didn't really have that experience, but also I went interdisciplinary quite quickly and then realized that my competition was much larger than I could deal with. It was extraordinary across the wider arts and humanities, like where do you begin? And also I think being part of the new generation thinker scheme, where I met you know, a lot of early career academics who were totally fired up and passionate about what they were doing. I just thought, you know what, you've just got to be in your own lane. And for me, what's been successful has been to sort of facilitate the participation of others, to get people involved in what I'm doing, to ask their advice, ask about collaboration, to just listen to their work and think about, that's interesting. They work on different theorists, they have different reference points, they've come at this from a different angle. How can I use that to expand my own way of thinking and to make my work speak to different audiences? So I would say, yeah, zoom out, I would say, in that way. Ask for advice. I was very lucky a few years ago to come to a senior academic at a TAPRA and present her with my CV. I just graduated, I think, and went, what's missing from this? What would, if you just were looking at this and what do you need? And she said to me, right, you need some publications. And then that gave me a goal, and I went, okay, fine, publications, focus on that. Like, it was just really helpful to have a short-term goal rather than focus on everything, achieve everything now. Like, ask for advice, focus on short-term goals. And I think for me, the big thing has been learning to try and be myself on purpose. I was an actor before this. I wasn't a public speaker, and I've had to learn to embrace my quirks. And when I didn't have confidence in myself, I did have confidence in the Actresses Franchise League, and I did have confidence in their story, so I could present them even if I didn't feel I was presenting me well. So that's been a journey too. And I think learning to embrace yourself as a human and as a scholar, to look for those points of connection, the things that fire you up about your work, also the things that frustrate you about your work, help to move you forward. So those are my thoughts on that. In terms, I don't have any, as Kate said, I do not have any major advice. I'm getting all sorts of shiny roles. I haven't had shiny roles. I've applied for funding and not got it. I've applied for funding and got it. I've applied for jobs and not got them. I've applied for jobs and got them. But I've never had a job that's more than a 0.5 for more than 2 years. I've worked continuously on short-term, part-time contracts, academic contracts. And so I've constantly, in the contract, been looking for the next thing. It's a bit like having an acting job where everyone goes after first night, so what are you up to next? And you go, So I think it's just been a sort of sense of running, but having the short-term goals has been really helpful. Finding a point of connection with my own research has been really helpful. Trying to be myself on purpose. For all the failure or all the quirks or the insecurities, I can only be me, so I might as well be me deliberately. And that's been a real release. And in terms of competition, I think just be in your own lane, zoom out, look at everything going on, and then think about what's good about you, what you're doing that's interesting, why you're an asset to anything, why you're an asset to yourself, and then focus on that and encourage other people to do the same.
That's absolutely marvellous, Naomi, and a wonderful note on which to finish. So I just hope that, can we all unmute and unmic and give Naomi a round of applause for her generosity and enthusiasm. Very much.
Thank you all very much.
So thank you so much, and thank you to TAPRA for making this hour possible. It's been a delight. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate, as well.
Privilege is mine. Okay, so Joe, I'll leave it to you to close the session, I think. Will the chat be saved